Thank you everyone for coming. My name is April Ju. I am a producer of the podcast Until Everyone is Free. And along with my teammates Wairumu Gadimba, Felix Amondi, and Stoneface Bomba, we have been putting on what is now become this open-ended series of teach-ins that we're calling Beyond the Bill, which obviously started last month. No, now it's been 2 months ago when these historic mass protests broke out throughout Kenya, initially in protest of Ruto's 2024 finance bill, but which very quickly and very intuitively became about much, much more than that. We're in this place now at the end of August where in the discourse, it feels like the biggest question that's hanging for everyone is what comes next. The cadence of street demonstrations themselves has really slowed down. There are even people online talking about, why or how this revolution has failed, to which I ask what people think revolution looks like. But there are all of these sort of open-ended questions about how we proceed, and most importantly, how in the coming weeks and months and years, we shift power from the level of the political elite slowly and systematically down to the grassroots, which is to say, how do we build power at the grassroots so that it is the people setting the agenda and the state responding rather than vice versa. And so for my teammates and I, we were talking about this, and it felt to us like such a shame that as these questions were percolating um, for Kenyans, and often it seemed like these questions were being shot out into the void with no answers, that just in Nairobi among us, we had in our presence so many Sudanese comrades, many of whom are quite literally revolutionaries, people who were in Dani in the 2018 and 19 revolution, who had experiences to share and had precisely the kinds of answers that we might be looking for. But of course, there were a lot of logistical challenges to having such dialogues, for example, language barrier, or more importantly, security issues. Most revolutionaries who are in Nairobi are obviously still anonymous. And so today we have the privilege of, on the one hand, inviting knowledgeable speakers who are able to speak about this openly and in clear terms that really resonate with the precise experience that the Kenyan movement is going through, but also as an accompaniment to today's discussion. And you can stay notified about this by following our social media. In the next coming days, we will release a pamphlet that gives the reflections anonymized and translated by one revolutionary, Sudanese revolutionary who is in Nairobi and was there to witness the Maandamano, and just kind of talking about their reflections of what feels different, what feels the same, how do we go from here? So hopefully between these two, this discussion and that pamphlet, we can begin to kind of create spaces for this kind of solidarity and dialogue. I'm really excited about, even though this session will be recorded and I think the vast majority of people will listen to this on the podcast, I am excited that those of you who are here today are in the quote unquote room with us, because it is precisely this kind of Pan-African dialogue, perhaps the comments that pop up in the chat, the question and answers, that I feel like are some of the most valuable things about this kind of exchange. So yes, feel free to say things in the chat, and at the very end, I will open up the floor for questions. I'll speak more about that in a bit. But let's begin. I want to introduce our three speakers who are with us today. And then after this, I will give about perhaps 10-minute background introduction or kind of history of some of the political events in Sudan that led to the moments that we'll be talking about. Number one, because I want to release our speakers to actually talk about the things that are being asked and not have this burden of always giving the background stuff, but also because I wanted to give this history or this introduction in a way that draws out what resonates with the Kenyan experience, because there is so much that is in common. So yeah, we have with us today Rabab El-Naim. She is a Sudanese activist, labor organizer, and former spokesperson for the Sudanese Workers Alliance for the Restoration of Trade Unions, or SWORTU. She's currently based in the United States and is a co-founder too of the Tar Mabuta podcast, which is a feminist, anti-capitalist podcast. We also have with us Hussam Mahjoub, a co-founder of Sudan Bukra, an independent nonprofit Sudanese TV channel that was launched back in 2019 as a media voice for the revolution. Hussam is a communications engineer, journalist, and the host of a show in Sudan Bukra that critically examines Sudanese politics through interviews with various political actors, including many resistance committee members, trade union leaders and members, and progressive writers and activists. And one of his eminent guests is also our final speaker, Qusay Hamroa Shekhuddin. Qusay is a researcher and consultant whose work seeks to illuminate synergies between technoscience and institutions in order to advance policies and solutions in sustainable design for socioeconomic systems and development governance. Somi, based in East Africa and Sudan. Most of Qusay's projects focus on African topics from a Pan-African perspective. And for today's discussion, Qusay will mostly be taking a bit of a backseat and just joining at the end to contextualize more of what Rabab and Hussam will speak about with me for the bulk of the discussion. So without further ado, I'm going to give a bit of an introduction. This is an introduction that is informed by a lot of solid analyses from various Sudanese scholars. My friend Teo will be dropping a link to some of these pieces, which if you want to explore later and read in full, I would encourage you to do. There's a lot here. This history that I give will be just scratching the surface. So yeah, let's begin. Though there is, of course, a very long history of organized resistance in Sudan, from the 1885 Mahdist Revolution to the October Revolution of 1964 to the 1985 Intifada. Today, for the purposes of this conversation, we're going to begin in the year 1989 when the National Islamic Front came to power through a military coup. This regime, called the Inqaz regime, or the Salvation Regime, Salvation State, was headed by Omar al-Bashir. And during Bashir's 30 years in power, he replaced old colonial, neo-colonial patterns of accumulation with neoliberal, private sector-friendly policies. So the colonial cash crop-based economy, for example, cotton, which used to be grown in these large, centrally managed irrigation schemes, shifted instead to crude oil export. And while the oil boom temporarily lifted Sudan into a middle-income country, Bashir's administration also sold off government assets en masse, most often to elites in his own ruling Islamist party. No surprise, many of these choices were textbook recommendations from our old friends at the IMF, World Bank, the World Trade Organization, not unlike what was happening in Kenya at that same time under Moi, of course. Unemployment grew rampant, especially in professional classes. Poverty and hunger swept through the country. Public discourse was choked, journalists censored, dissidents were tortured, killed, fled into exile. It's not surprising then that such a system bred incredible corruption, with elites effectively capturing the entire economy. So later, when our speakers discuss organized farmers' resistance, this part here, the privatization of agricultural schemes and the loss of their old centers for organizing, is going to be important to remember and understand. Of course, there was resistance. Number one, there was resistance from labor unions who organized strikes protesting the coup that landed Bashir in power. The regime responded by throwing these labor union leaders into what were known as ghost houses. So think Nyayo House torture chambers, but sort of scattered throughout the country. And the regime also dismantled them by consolidating them into those led by members of the ruling party and then banning independent unions. Number two, there was also resistance from university students, not unlike in Kenya. The regime also threw them in large numbers into ghost houses and initiated a strategy to co-opt campuses. And then number three, of course, there was armed resistance. This is what Sudanese refer to in shorthand as the forest or the bush. By the time that Bashir came to power, there was already an ongoing war with the Sudanese People's Liberation Army, or SPLA. And this was a rebel group formed against the government's unjust distribution of resources. While previous governments in Khartoum cast the conflict as Arabs versus Africans or Muslims versus infidels, Bashir actually escalated this war into full-out jihad, sacrificing countless young men to fight what he called vengeful Southerners, giving them little keys to hang on their necks to open the gates of paradise if they died as martyrs. And so Bashir's unpopular austerity measures and his stoking of racial, ethnic, and religious differences always went hand in hand. Under Bashir, state violence intensified in South Sudan, the Nuba Mountains, Blue Nile, and in Darfur, where in 2003, the Janjaweed militia and other paramilitaries carried out a genocide against non-Arab Darfuris. So then in 2005, a comprehensive peace agreement, it's literally called that, CPA, was signed between the government of Sudan, the political opposition alliance, and rebel groups. However, these, quote, handshake politics, aka gaining stability by splitting the pie amongst elites, but changing no root structures. This was a precedent that later in 2019 in the revolution hung in the minds of protesters as a non-solution that must be avoided. Now let's fast forward to 2011. South Sudan had gained its independence, and with it went most of the oil fields. The prongs of resistance that I mentioned earlier had been by then largely dismantled. And also the Arab Spring had ignited, radiating out both political momentum, but also a new way of organizing using social media. So then in 2012 came a new spark. Bashir announced austerity measures, which would basically result in fuel prices doubling overnight. And so student protests broke out on university campuses throughout Sudan. They borrowed tactics and language from the Arab Spring protests and named the Arab protests. For example, the Friday of the Kandaka, the Friday of the Habub, or one that was quite similar actually to the Kenyan Maandamano's Day of Outrage, the Friday of Anger. The regime responded violently, and protests rarely lasted more than half an hour. Not unlike what was happening in Kenya just in the last couple of months, the groups did not yet have the capacity to organize sustained protests and set the agenda. And vile Ruto alikuwa anasema like, ona Sudan, usichome nchi yenu, you don't want to be like Sudan. At that time, Bashir was telling protesters, ona Syria, you want to be like Syria. And so by 2013, Bashir curtailed student protests by literally closing schools and universities. He dug in, introducing even more austerity measures. And at that point, watu walisema, anguka nayo. Anguka nayo. The following day, not matatu, but bus drivers, the equivalent of matatu drivers and makangas in Kenya, went on strike. The day after that, middle-class folks and students joined them. So this cross-class, cross-regional unity, but also the boldness of protesters who burned vehicles and attempted to enter government buildings, this all frightened the government. And just like the open state violence we saw Ruto unleash on the streets of Nairobi, Bashir decided to take things to another level. In September 2013, Bashir sent the Janjaweed militia to kill protesters. The government shut off the internet and watched blood flow in the streets. In a single weekend, more than 300 protesters, the official number at least, were killed. And so this was the moment after which Sudanese began organizing in ways that 5 years later would make the revolution possible. I won't go more into that here because our speakers will talk about that. But that very year, 2013, Bashir formally instated the Janjaweed militia as the Rapid Support Forces, or RSF. He selected as its leader Mohammed Hamdan Dagalo, who's also known as Hemeti. The RSF was then constitutionally accepted as a regular force with a chain of command separate to that of the Sudanese Armed Forces, or SAF. So already you see here the contours of what has led to the current war, which needless to say has become one of the greatest humanitarian emergencies of this moment. But just to hold a bit on the RSF, because this war has been, called by outside observers a civil war or simply a personal spat between two military men. Sudanese scholar Majdi al-Jazuli writes that, quote, the RSF itself is a neoliberal army. It is the privatized army of the third world in a rural periphery. If Margaret Thatcher were to create an army in rural Sudan, it would be the RSF. It functions as a corporate structure. It is led by a single family and is not answerable to anybody. Here, the market system creates new commodities and sells them, even when no market previously existed. And so here, Al-Jazuli is referring to commodities like narcotics, minerals, and contraband cars, but also humans, soldiers. And at the same time that the RSF was committing war crimes in Darfur in 2015 and 2014, it was sending young men, desperately poor young men, to fight in Yemen, as well as in the Central African Republic, Libya, and Chad. This allowed Hemeti to separately build relations with the UAE, with Saudi Arabia, and yes, with William Samoei Ruto. For those who don't know, Hemeti himself has been warmly welcomed in Nairobi already a few times, including during this ongoing war. Since South Sudan's secession, in Sudan, gold has replaced oil as the major source of income. And in a very short time, Sudan has become Africa's largest exporter of gold, almost all of which is smuggled by the RSF into the UAE, which in return smuggles weapons back to the RSF. If you have a well-organized smuggling network, then you can, to use corporate lingo, scale, enter new markets, like debt investment, which is another way of saying trapping the desperately poor in debt, or security for pastoralist routes, or harvest control, so basically militarizing agricultural production. And all this is to say that even before the first shot was fired in the war, the current war, rural Sudan had already been completely militarized. So to sum all of this up, I explain this to make clear that it was this kind of a system, such a system that was completely rotten to its core, a system that is so far from any image of democracy in any sense of the word, a system in which ordinary Sudanese had so little agency over their lives, let alone any kind of prosperity. It was, and I haven't even mentioned, of course, all these other longstanding grievances, like those of women in such a society. But it was against such a system, such an unjust, violent, cruel, and exploitative system against which the protesters of the December Revolution of 2018 and 19, it was against such a system that their anger burned, and it was such a system that they fought to destroy. So with that, without any further ado, I think we can get right into it. So Rabab and Hussam, let's begin where I just left off in September 2013. You could paint a picture for us. What was in the airwaves of political discourse at that time? Or how did these mass demonstrations, but also the horror of the state violence that followed, how did it make people feel? Or more importantly, what did it change? What did it make people realize?
Okay, let me start here, April, and thank you very much for this summary. It's actually very yeah, you were able to give the Sudanese modern history in less than 10 minutes. I think a summary of the Sudanese modern history in less than 10 minutes. That's impressive. So let me start by saying that the opposition to the regime, the Umar al-Bashir regime or the Inqadh regime, started from the night they took the power in June 1989. And as you brilliantly explained, this included students, included trade unions, included the armed movements or rebels, and it went by it had waves of ups and downs. The regime was very able in understanding how the previous dictatorships were the dictatorship of Aboud in 1964 was toppled by the October Revolution, 1964, and the dictatorship of Nimeri was also toppled by the Intifada of 1985. So they started breaking down the trade unions and the student universities and did everything they could to make sure that no popular movement is able to stand and fight. They infiltrated the political parties. So all the sorts of and the atrocities and the ghost houses and what you talked about. What happened in 2013 was in many ways a rehearsal of the 2018 revolution. So 2013, in the aftermath of the Arab Spring, there were a few new elements in the struggle. Social media was huge. It wasn't there in 1989. The fact that the regime killed people cold-blooded in the streets of Khartoum, as you said, in a few days, killing more than 200, 300 people. This was new to so many people. People always knew that the regime was committing atrocities in the south and in Darfur, but because of the media, the government-controlled media, not everyone really believed that, or not everyone was even aware of what was happening there, because you could easily portray that as Western propaganda or not true, simply. But for many people, especially young men and women, it was true in front of their eyes that the regime was killing people. And as you said, it was also one of the first times that first shows of power by the Rapid Support Forces. The Rapid Support Forces was fighting in Darfur, but Umar al-Bashir brought them, and they were among the main forces that killed the people, the protesters in the streets of Khartoum. It wasn't Khartoum only. So another element of being a rehearsal for 2018 revolution is that although of course, the majority of the protests were in Khartoum, the most effective ones, the ones in the media, but it happened also in other places, Medani, for example, and other places in Sudan. So the introduction of social media, the use of social media as a tool for organizing, as a tool of informing, was important. The need it wasn't led by political parties, and that's important also. The September 2013 revolution or protests were not led by political parties. It had participants from all political parties, but they relied on neighborhood structures, and they were not structures then, but they were I think the seeds of the resistance committees that mushroomed in the years after. They grouped together people from different political affiliations, ideologies, different walks of life, classes, who saw the need that to participate in these protests against the regime that for so many years oppressed them. After the 2013, so the regime and learned a few lessons from the 2013 revolution. Shutting the internet was an important one, because this continued in 2018. It continued throughout the next protests leading to the 2018. So in December 2018, one of the first acts of the regime was shutting off the social media. So people relied on VPN and relied on personal communications, which is also one of the things that led to people realizing the need to have these forms of organizing that bring them together. In the aftermath of the September 2013, there were calls by different people, different political parties to establish what they called resistance committees. So I'm sure that there were many, but as an example, the Sudanese Communist Party in November 2016 issued a communique calling for the establishment of resistance committees. So members of this party and other parties as well, this was echoed in the few years to come, resorted to establishing these committees. The government crushed the 2013 protest, arrested so many people, but the fact that you have a new generation of young people, men and women, whom were mostly basically children of the regime, the Inqadh regime. They were born in the or they grew up in the years of the Inqadh regime, who had no recollection of the history of the political opposition to the previous regimes. This led to one of the things that led to the 2018 revolution, December protests. So people started organizing in the neighborhoods. These are resistance committees, and in the workplace. Again, resistance committees in the workplace. People started organizing. There had always been the trade unions, what they call the doctors and the engineers and teachers had their own structures. Of course, there are the government ones, the official ones, but the opposition or the opposition or people who oppose the government had kept some sorts of trade unions bodies. I won't maybe I won't go as far as calling them trade unions, but this led to the establishment of the Sudanese Professional Association, SPA. So throughout the years between 2013 and 2018, this SPA became something that grouped together professionals from different professions, and they are also very well connected to the political parties. This, I think, led to when 2018 December 2018 protests broke out, led to having the SPA and people from different neighborhoods organizing, seeing the seed to organize. I think Rabab can complement what I said here.
Thank you, Hussam, and thank you, April. I think Hussam basically said it all, but I would just like to point out that following September 2013, the shock of the violence in Khartoum street in particular, because the violence has been an consistent existence within post-colonial Sudan. But the shock of seeing that in the street kinda opened the public to the idea of decentralization. And maybe that was one of the seeds that allowed neighborhood resistance committee to expand. It has always been there in Sudan, even before an Inqadh regime. It's not a new idea. But I think that decentralization started there because you really, with a centralized, non-violent, or let's say, I really don't like using violent versus unviolence. I prefer armed versus unarmed. So an armed population versus an armed militia like RSF, in a centralized setting, you're bound to end with it like seconds, right? And we've seen this in 2018. We had like better street taxes, you can say, right? But those street tactic kind of was, I think, developed there. And another important like concept of organizing that I've seen post September 2013 is voluntary work. with the shock of with the economical shock of losing the oil revenue and more austerity measurement by the day, that kind of increased the state shrinking in public sectors, for example, in educational sector, in health sector, right? So there's a lot of initiative that kind of taught us organically how to communicate, how to organize, and how to handle that. And even before 2013, and I think maybe after the comprehensive peace agreement, there was some sort of like high hopes of what to come from that peace agreement, and then the disappointment of what we've seen later on. And that kind of also started a lot of youth movement because they really weren't able to find themselves within traditional, let's say, political parties with the two sides. If you say more to the left or more to the right, although like I really don't agree with the analysis, but it's true, it's observational, like we've seen this, right? So I would say two things, the need of a decentralized and the need to organize within like the health sector, within the educational sector. We've seen a lot of initiative, and I think that kind of taught us. And even when Hussam mentioned the different, let's say, call them labor organization, right? He did correctly mention that you really can't classify them by definition to be unions, but they are worker organization, and they're very political because to begin with, they are formed from those workers who, like whether professional, former sector, particularly, who are involved within the Sudanese political scene, traditional Sudanese political scene, right? But I specifically remember the Dr. Body, I will just say like the Dr. I think Central Committee, correct name, if I remember correctly, they were able to break through because they were able to link the struggle between medical students in general, different medical field students, and professional. So that kind of created a bridge that we've never seen before, at least post an inqaz, post 1990 or something, right? Especially after the murder of Ali Fadl. We've never seen that type of bridge. And I think um, that was key for me, at least, because we've always had an active student body in terms of struggling and resisting. And we've always kind of low-key also had a professional one, but we were never able to make that connection. And I think that connection went a long way forward. But yeah, I think that's it.
Thank you so much. I want to return to the resistance committees later because I think there's a lot to be said about them. But while we're on the topic of unions right now, could you help us understand, because I think for Kenyans, oftentimes there is a pretty rigid understanding of what constitutes a union. You know, it's something that has the seal that's certified, that you have to pass through, you know, the government. Basically, the government needs to approve that this union is here. And when people think unions, most Kenyans think of these large, bloated, corrupt, you know, unions like KOTU that don't really act in the best interests of their workers. But to help us expand our ideas of what a union could look like, even if it's not, you know, technically a union, could you speak to us about, for example, unions of informal workers? So I'm thinking of these tea sellers who are predominantly women, migrant workers, or women from who are displaced from other regions, or any other informal unions that you could think of. How did these unions of workers who are, you know, casual workers, what in, you know, Kenya we call vibarua, or like, you know, day by day work, how did these unions, what role did they play both in these workers' everyday lives and then also in larger political movements?
Okay. So I really liked what you mentioned earlier about what people claim or seem to perceive as a failed revolution, right? Because what is a revolution? And I think particularly, that's a big question, but particularly that part about voluntary work, for example, in the health sector, in the educational sector, to me, that is revolutionary work because it's consistently try to improve people's daily lives, right? But also this, because we have that question of what is revolutionary, we also have a question of what is a union, right? And we can't really think of like what is the union question without thinking of the economical structure. Um, in Sudan, and I imagine across the global south, um, years of austerity measures. So even before al-Bashir regime, privatization have been going on, right? And shrinking of the public sector have been going on. That came with a change or a shift in the educational service because we shifted from a production based economy or even a crush cop based economy into a service based economy. The banking sector became the biggest sector within like the 70s, right? And we have more service sector. So we don't really have production and we don't really have an educational system that supports that. We have a professional class, but that professional class is declining and suffering from more unemployment because the state itself, the bigger employer, is declining, right? Versus that. So I think the idea of what is a union is to begin with, unions are a very primitive form of organizing labor because it really doesn't tackle the core problem. It's not radical enough or revolutionary enough because it doesn't really change the nature of production relation, right? You're always going to be an employer. There's always going to be an employee, right? It's not going to change that. So I that's why I really don't want to like be caught up in the idea of where is a union because at the end of the day we're trying to promote this idea of self-determination. We're trying to improve the day-to-day livelihood. So whatever body that can bring that change, I would like move forward that body as long as that body actually expresses and has checks and balances to live through democracy. And I'm also very cautious these days with using the word democracy because there's this quote that I really like of it's very normal for, and I'm not sure about the accurate quote, but it goes to explain that it's very normal for a neoliberal or a bourgeoisie to talk about democracy, but a true revolutionary or a radical will be to which class benefits or to which class interest that democracy will go, right? So it's a very slippery slope concept, right? And unless you ground it in people actually exercising self-determination. So that's why like I really don't think it's necessarily beneficially to talk about that state seal on unions. And the irony is within post-colonial Sudan, unions pre-existed, like pre-existed the post-colonial Sudan. Farmer unions, for example, were as early as 1953. And this is the colonial Egyptian British ruling class kind of recognizing the farmers union, right? And we have documented worker strike as early as 1908, right? And quote unquote independence of Sudan happened in 1956. So the idea of unionization or the idea of coming together to express and to practice self-determination, right? And to improve our livelihood through that pre-existed the state, right? And we also have a huge history, and again, I imagine the global south, of the state co-opting unions. So that idea of waiting for a state seal is actually you opening the door for co-option, right? So that's why I will be, let's not hang up on this idea of a state union. The informal sector, so like with this change in the economical structure of Sudan, that increased the informal sector, right? People still need to live, right? And within that, the Sudanese state itself, because the economy was just declining from one day to the other, kind of used that informal sector as a source of tax. The informal sector is very interesting. Labor relationship is different, right? An employer will serve as the employee the next day. Especially, for example, let's talk about this. And I'm a big fan. That's why I would like to talk about Bahri Industrial Zone. It's a very interesting work relationships, right? Um, they have been able to fight this struggle and to, for example, one of the wins that they were able to get is they were able to get a clinic back. Historically, in Bahrain Industrial Zone, they were the clinic for workers, right, with their taxed money that I think it was like in the 1980s was somewhere lost between the public ministry of health and between the local administrative unit and so on with corruption and all of that, and state shrinking from the public health sector, somehow workers lost that critical health unit in the industrial zone. So workplace safety was a very serious issue, right? And they were able to fight this struggle throughout the transitional period, and they were able to get the transitional government, with, although it's a very neoliberal anti-revolutionary government, they were able to get that right, and they were able to actually live the revolution because they were able to self-determination and improve their livelihood. Unfortunately, the work cut that short. They had huge plans of how to even have that clinic live to a certain standard, how to improve work safety practices, and all of that. And from conversation with different workers and organizers, from blue collar organizers, specifically in Bahrain Industrial Zone, um, I've seen them being interested in different, like, what, me being more of a professional and not a blue collar, I'm a white collar, not a blue collar, I wouldn't have thought of that, right? This is the self-determination here. For example, they even had tea sellers that were trying to join the union. That's why the labor relationship is very different, very interesting. It will not even fit in your union structure. That's why we don't need to get hung up on the union structure, right? They wanted to join the Bahrain Industrial, and they call themselves Bahrain Industrial Resistance Committee. And their first request to join what they need English lessons. They just said that they need to do that. And if this is their goal, if this is what they're trying to do, their body should enable that. And it reminded me of a story of Korean women in the US here, I think in San Francisco. They were an academic an academic lefty was trying to help organize them, right? And when they reached out, they were like, we need English classes, English lessons. And everyone was like, the academic left was like in shock, like, what, you're trying to fit in? And the explanation, the reasoning from this Korean woman was that we are trying to learn English so that we can defend ourselves. So though we have an open conversation, open communication with our employer. And to me, that is the highest form of self-determination. So I'm not sure if I answered your question, but I really like that story about San Francisco and learning English. But so I can you remind me of the question, April? Sorry, I think I spaced out.
I think you did. I think you did answer it quite well, because it's the sense that what is the, like, the purpose of a union, you know, to not get hung up on the form of the union itself and trying to fit the goals of a people's movement into that. That's backwards, but rather that in improving people's daily lives through self-determination, that eventually you get, like, that is the whole point. But yeah, I really appreciate that. But Hussam, do you have anything to add to that in terms of the informal workers who
Yeah,
back
yeah, yeah. Actually, yeah, Rabab talked very well about this, the both formal and informal. But what I want to say in the context of what happened between 2013 and 2018 is so the government tactics managed to erode the trust of the people on the political parties. The political parties were so inefficient, so hung up in the internal divisions and infighting, in within and without. So the need to have bodies that brought together people in any form was crucial. This need was crucial, and as we said, they are not trade unions, but they call themselves legitimate trade unions. These are the reminiscents of the trade unions that were present in the third democracy between 1985 and 1989. Continued, but with bringing new graduates who are mostly politically oriented. So if you are a student, you're politically active. you are a member of one of the political parties or bodies within the student movement. You graduate, you join one of these legitimate trade unions or trade union bodies. Like the tea sellers union and other unions like the bus drivers, and these were important because they brought together for the first time people who are not necessarily coming from a political the traditional political system, the upbringing. You graduate, you finish, you go to school, university, you join a political party, then you join a trade union. So these were important. They served their members. Because these were grassroots based. The tea sellers union was really impressive. Mostly women who are mostly migrants who are coming from other parts of Sudan, who generally are less fortunate. They are single moms in most cases, taking care of children and relatives. The need to organize was a real need. It was not because of a political demand. And of course, when you do organizing the right way, or you do it to serve your needs, it's soon enough that you realize that, well, you need to be political. You cannot stay away of politics. So the erosion of the trust of the political parties led to the need to have different forms of organizing. And I think, again, just fast forward to 2018, there was this need to have different forms of organizing. The political parties could not take the lead because the government, the regime's propaganda was so strong, and that was a deliberate, I think, successful tactic by the political parties then to keep the revolution's leadership under this mysterious body, the Sudanese Professional Association. So one of the things about the SPA in the 2018, December 2018, that no one really knew who was in the SPA, who were the leaders of the SPA, which no one had could tell who were these leaders. People started following a Facebook page that started publishing the dates and times for daily protests, and like people on the street started to follow these dates and times. They started reading and communicating the press releases by the SPA, and this in turn led to the need to organize other forms of bodies, which are like the resistance committees. So yeah, I think that is what I can add here.
Thank you so much. But I think that's a great place to then go now into the resistance committees themselves. Both of you mentioned at some point that these were not brand new. They took a new form, a more systemic form leading up to 2018. But could you just take us through the origins of this? Maybe not just mostly since 2013. How did they exist before? But more importantly, in what way were they established in this systematic way that built up that made 2018 possible?
Yeah. So in Sudan, we have always, I mean, the post-colonial Sudan, the state was absent from many parts of Sudan, and people relied on themselves to provide the services and whatever means of life that they could. We call one of the forms that we use is called nafir. Nafir is where people they come together to as an example, during the floods, and these are the floods days. They come and fix structures to prevent the floods from coming into their villages. They would have an affair to build or maintain a school or a clinic or a health, a medical facility, medical center. So these, because of because of necessity, this has been always there in Sudan. People relied on each other socially. I mean, if the Sudanese people relied on the state, it would have been, I mean, yeah, this is a disastrous state that was never representing any significant, like a significant portion of the people. So with the before and after, so there were various forms of this. No one called them resistance committees. There were calls for resistance committees by leading political persons. I mentioned here the Sudanese Communist Party, but it was actually before that. One of the earliest mentions of resistance committees was Dr. Farouk Muhammad Ibrahim, who's a leading academic and leading political figure in Sudan since the 60s. But what happened in the 2013, the September 2013, people realized the shortcomings of the political parties and realized that what made the September 2013 protest effective was this reliance on people in the neighborhoods. They know they know their neighborhoods. The protests were not central, so they were not in one place in Khartoum. This was the case in previous years, but this was not the case in September 2013, and this was increased even more in 2018, where there were different protests every day in different parts of Khartoum, which led to the spread out of the regime's security forces. And the protests would not be only during the day, as an example. So one of the first drivers of the establishment of resistance committees in the neighborhoods was having nightly protests. So when the police and security forces think that they are done, they finish. The 1 p.m. Protests were dispersed. At 8 or 9 p.m. in different parts of Khartoum and different parts of other parts of Sudan, small but yet consistent nightly protests would break out, and this. So the SPA and the collection of the political parties that was called Forces of Freedom and Change, which was basically it was announced in January 2019. So bringing together the SPA and the different political parties, realized that this is something that they should build, and then the press releases from both the FCC and the SPA started calling people to establish their own resistance committees, and this happened. So at that time, the SPA was really magical in how the people perceived what was published in the SPA Facebook page, where they called for the establishment of resistance committees. People were doing it without realizing that, well, this is a resistance committee. So people started adding some form of organization to it. Well, having a name, having names, having communication channels, having Facebook pages, having banners, calling them funny names, the Republic of Al-Haj Yusuf, as an example. Yeah, or the Tigers of Al-Abbasiyya, or whatever. So and so it's like the snowball. Every single act was an additional element in strengthening the protest, bringing more people to it, and unleashing fear on the regime. At the same time, one of the main things, we are all, the three of us here, or all of us, Ayer, Bababan, we are outside Sudan. one of the things that that this led to was the participation of the diaspora, Sudanese diaspora. So the revolution or December revolution was not able to couldn't have toppled Omar al-Bashir and his like the leadership of his regime without the active participation of Sudanese in all parts of the world, in Sudan and outside Sudan. And one of the venues of this participation was people who, like me, live in the United States, would very quickly connect with the neighborhood or the resistance committee of.
We'll never find
I
out.
think I think we lost Hassan for a second.
But while we wait for Hussam to come back, because it doesn't look like he's switching back on, Rabab, could you maybe
I don't wanna contradict. I think he was trying to make I also I absolutely recognize, and I'm also a huge fan of Resilience Committee, but I think we just also like an advocate of labor organizing. So I want to talk a little bit about, I really don't think it's accurate to study resistance committee as if there is like a unification between them, even within the 2018 setting, and not necessarily before that. True, the horizontal structure or maybe the way of practicing popular democracy was present in almost all of them. Hussam, you would like to finish your idea?
No, I think I'm done. I'm sorry, my phone, the
Okay.
temperatures, yeah.
Ooh,
And it's 9
hot.
a.m.,
Okay.
10 a.m. here. So yeah.
Okay.
But yeah, I think I said what I wanted to say, basically. So.
Perfect. Okay, so going back to what I was trying to share is, although the popular democracy practices are similar in a lot of them, but we need to realize that there is no unification, there is no almost copy paste of structure on all of that, right? Even within the creation of the political school, let's say, of resistance committee, the closer, like one can say that the closer the resistance committee is to the center of power and wealth, the more reformist that resistance committee is going to be. We've started seeing political charter coming from the peripheries, coming from Mayerno, which is a small city in Sinnar in West South Sudan. So, and Khartoum, the capital, was late to follow, right? And even their like the day-to-day practice, the day-to-day building of networks between resistance committee, there was a lot of almost resistance because the political agenda is different, right? Of someone who is in the peripheries versus someone who's closer to the center, right? They both have demands, but those demands are a bit different, right? So there's no unification. We've also seen some resistance committee trying to come up with structure again with a state stamp, or let's just say with some sort of like how I don't know how to best frame it, but a procedure that is not necessarily available to anyone. In particular, I'm talking about the resistance committee in Khartoum, Bahri, who wanted to hold elections and have like public open meetings, and all is good. But they have the ability to do that. They have access to electricity, they have laptops, they have 9 to 5 jobs, which means they have the evening free to do that. On the other hand, this does not make them, like this doesn't make that resistance committee more legitimate or more revolutionary or deserving of support or anything from a resistance committee that meet under a tree in a tea selling lady on the market or on route to work, because they don't have electricity. They don't know how to use laptops. They don't know how to do surveys and all of that, right? They haven't necessarily practiced the new liberal sense of democracy, let's say that, right? But they are practicing self-determination, right? They're being political and they're being active. So I think that created a lot of friction. But generally speaking, what I think helped strengthen resilience committee especially in early 2019, not just the decentralization, but also engaging with different sectors within the community. This is based on geographical, and I say this with a grain of salt, right? Because I still maintain the stand that a resilience committee in a poor neighborhood in Khartoum will have a lot more in common with the resilience committee in the periphery than in a different, more affluent neighborhood within Khartoum, right? But we've seen, especially across major cities, not just Khartoum, is the ability to engage with the public, right? And this kind of helped with the idea of grassroots organizing because it's increased political um, participation. It created a two-way stream where and we actually had a schedule where on a Saturday you do, and this is in early 2019, where on a Saturday you do some sort of a neighborhood activity where you reach different age group, chapter tender, maybe you fix a mosque, maybe you work in a local clinic, maybe you clean just a playground. This show them that the revolution is actually trying to improve day-to-day life. By the time it comes Thursday, 1 p.m., where we have unification among like taking to the street, but in a decentralized way, we had support within the neighborhood. We had families, we have elder people, we had different sectors from the community who are anticipating and feeling like they are part of this movement. So this created also a lot of safety. We had a lot of in-ground clinics, especially on the early 2019, and that also created communication, and it helped a lot with being able to stand against the state violence, especially in the early 2019. So again, I really think that we need just to be like critical and aware of the fact that whatever, like there is no one magical solution, right? It's not just true for labor organizing, but it's also true for organizing based on geographical regions. And we also need to realize that whatever type of organizing actually reflect the socio-political class behind it, right? Again, a regional committee in a poor neighborhood in Khartoum will definitely have a lot more in common. They will even have less access to the internet because basically they don't have that. They don't necessarily have access to diaspora, right? To help them with having like an internet, like a presence online, right? Or even if they do, they don't necessarily have access to the internet so that they can have that communication. But somehow they're still able to practice self-determination. So I guess what I'm trying to say, and this is similar to the messaging that I had earlier, is um, we need to just be aware of the socio-economical class behind any form of organizing and not to fall within the trap of what is a neoliberal framing of organizing, whether they're union or resistance committee or so on. And it's true always, the closer you are to the center of power, the more reformist you are. Yeah.
I think that's really important, especially in a place like Kenya, but also really Nairobi, where the NGOization of like
Mm.
social organizing is very, very strong, to the point where it has gotten to a point where perhaps people there, in many parts of Nairobi, especially in the informal settlements, there is a lot of, communal living. There are a lot of these practices. And in fact, some of the, a lot of people, middle class people at the protests were realizing, kind of learning about this police violence for the first time, when for people who live in Mathare, people who live in Nairobi's more informal settlements, this is old news. They know the police act in this way, and they have been able to organize much more communally, to protest, especially when police violence is happening. So on that note, I wanted to ask, because many of the people who are attending and who will be listening to this later are Kenyans who participated in the protests and who perhaps are interested in beginning to organize in this way. I think it would be useful for people to understand at a more mechanical level, if you could just give us a closer look inside some of these resistance committees. Obviously, they're quite different. Raval, you mentioned that some were much more, outward focused and had more resources, and some were much simpler. But some of the important principles that I want to ask about are, how were decisions made, for example, or how was power distributed when there were conflicts? How were those resolved? Because I think some of these are the very useful nitty gritty kind of basic things that can be difficult to talk about. And obviously, Nairobi is so different from Khartoum, but in many similar ways, I think people are asking, what does it look like to have something that is truly self-organized, that isn't sort of a program imposed by some, NGO or some civil society organization? What does self-organization, or what can self-organization look like?
Yeah, so let me take this point, April. And as Rabab said, so the membership of these resistance committees differed from one committee to the other. You would find some committees in central Khartoum that are closer to the power structure. Some other committees in the outskirts of Khartoum that are closer to the committees in the peripheries of Sudan, as an example. It depends on the location and the economic and social attributes. So that is one main thing. Different resistance committees included members from students, university graduates, unemployed, young people. It's not only young, because there are many older people in resistance committees. And as Rabab said, because of the different activities, they included families, and even children, although that was a debate whether to allow them to participate in political activities or not. But in general, the resistance committees did not have solid structures. The structure was flat and fluid with no hierarchies. Some resistance committees, and of course this depends on the experiences of the majority of the members. And in Sudan, we tend to respect the opinions of those whom we think are more educated and more experienced. So in the resistance committees, or the places, neighborhoods where there are like graduates, professionals, or university activists from the days of university, they would listen to their opinions. So this led to some committees establishing offices dedicated to things like communication, finance, and administration. But in general, at the beginning of December, in 2019, no, I don't recall a resistance committee that started drafting a political charter, as an example. The decisions were taken in with the participation of all the members, because people are the members are living in one place or working in one place, because there are resistance committees in the workplace as well. So they meet, they talk, they discuss, and then they take decisions. There is no leadership. My understanding is that in many cases they avoid resorting to voting as a mechanism to take decisions. So they discuss things until they reach a consensus and move forward. However, let me add one thing also, maybe interesting, to how the transitional government, which was supposed to be the revolution, the government that the revolution brought to power, because as soon as there was in 2019, August 2019, there was an agreement reached between the political parties and the military that toppled Omar al-Bashir, and they established a transitional government. They call it civilian-led. There is a prime minister, a civilian prime minister. But this government started immediately trying to pacify the resistance committees, and started to basically saying, well, no more protests, no more political activities to that sort that led to the collapse of, or the toppling of the old regime. We want you now to go and build Sudan. And they even passed the law establishing something called the
service
change,
and change.
yeah,
Yes,
service and
change. Yep.
change committees, where the resistance committees were supposed to play to administer and manage the supply and the distribution of fuel in gas stations and and bread. So basically, limiting their activities. So that was the time when many of the revolutionaries and the Sudanese people realized that, well, they need to organize and take their organizing to a next level. And this was when, at a later stage, we noticed that, or we saw some resistance committees coming up with political charters. Mairnu, the resistance committee of Mairnu was one, the one that Rabab talked about. And to know, it's a very small town that many people in Sudan, a lot of people of Sudan probably haven't heard its name. But this resistance committee issued a political charter. Then another, like after many people started to having these charters, starting to have, depending on where you are and the composition of the membership, started to having then trying to establish some sort of structure to the resistance committee, to their own committees, started to realize the need to group or unite or coordinate in coordination bodies. So these coordination bodies included neighborhoods that are close to each other, and then coordination bodies for on the level of state. And this was one thing that continued to happen gradually in different parts of Sudan and different.
I think, Hussam, you muted yourself.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. Until October 2021, October 2025, 2021, when the military toppled the civilian-led government and had the coup. So a coup basically against the transitional government, which was met from the early hours of with resistance and with protests from the resistance committees. And that led also to taking the resistance committees were the de facto leaders of the protests and the opposition to the new coup. And I think Rabab can talk a little bit here, but after the fact that the resistance committee members were leading the protests against the coup, we saw more political charters coming from different committees and from different coordination bodies, until like succeeding in over a more than a year period of reaching one unified political charter for all or most of the resistance committees. I only want to say, I want to add one thing here, that the fear from the resistance committees was not only among the military or among the political parties in the transitional government. It was actually among all the traditional elites of the country, the political parties. I mean, I started earlier, or I said at one point that as an example, the Communist Party, the Sudanese Communist Party, was called for the establishment of resistance committees in 2016, but we know for a fact that leaders of the Communist Party itself had doubts on the resistance committees. So it's basically all the traditional political establishment who were not accustomed to this level of or this new form of organizing. They had their doubts, and they tried to deal with it in various ways. One of them is basically infiltrating them or trying to pacify them as the transitional government did.
Thank you so much.
And Rabab.
I'll add 2 points. I think the main question here is how decisions are being made, and I'll link this to the point that Hussam just made of the Resistance Committee being a major political player and actually having an effect on the political scene. I think this is definitely because of transparency, right? And that's why they're feared, because of transparency, because of that checks and balances, that two-way stream of even resistance committee needing to answer to the public, right? So if you need to answer to the public, no room for no transparency. You have to be transparent. And we had multiple attempts of the international community of trying to engage resistance committee in quote unquote talks, but closed door talks. Resistance committee will come up saying like we're open to talking, but we need to live stream this on Facebook. To that request, international community usually backed up because resistance committee themselves realize that their strength is coming from that transparency. So I would say that's a core thing in organizing. Another point that Hussam brilliantly mentioned is the law of, and this is just like a rough translation of change and service, and that was end of 2019, early 2020, right after the partnership between the civilian side and the military side. So the start of the transitional period. And to me, this the way Hussam just mentioned it, the way he explained it, that is alienation 101. Like that's really the core of alienating the people from wealth, from access to resources. Because what's basically was asked of resistance committee is we'll do the politics, we'll decide how economy happens. You just go ahead and distribute as we see fit. So you don't get to practice self-determination. You don't get to practice how or where resources is used or how wealth is redistributed and so on. And as a critique for all of us here, I think we have still not really figured out how to handle that because the political discourse at that point was between two ends. One end wanted to take that chance and to actually help with distributing bread, like organizing fuel and all of that. And the other end was like, no, they're trying to depoliticize us, which is correct. But the way to respond to that is just to remain political. And I think the fact that we were not able to merge those two, we kind of miss your major question earlier, April, of what is a revolution, because we were not able to use and political organization to affect, not just to like handle like the day-to-day end task and user task, but to actually affect how bread is produced, right? And then how it's distributed and so all of that. And I think it's still a learning process for us in Sudan. And I guess it's always like, right, the revolution is a continuous process. It never really start or end. But I think that that marriage, that divorce between the political and like the livelihood is where we need to do more work. And once we're able to come along and like figure that out, we'll just we have figured out the big question of how do we exist, produce, and reproduce cooperatively at the end of the day, because that's the core of it, right? And these are 2 points I wanted to just add.
Yeah, thank you so much, Rabab. I think this is so relevant in Kenya as well, where as people are struggling with like what is what would this movement look like? What does the this uprising mean? I think people often struggle with this idea of political work or being something that people in offices do or people at NGOs do or people who are being interviewed by media on the street are doing, and then you have like normal people or like normal life. And of course that's not true because and especially in a place like Nairobi where the majority of people in Nairobi are struggling with the very material day-to-day things that people in Sudan also were. Those things are completely linked. Your community, the power, your self-determination, all of these things are deeply linked to both the everyday and these other things, and how to combine the two in ways that continue to earn public trust, but also to build power in ways that aren't so easily co-opted by other classes. That's really, really important. I have one final question where I'm going to bring in, I'm going to unleash Guy to answer that. But before I ask, and while he gets ready, and Teo, you can unmute him, I just wanted to remind people here that after this last question, we will open up the floor for questions. I see there's one that has been written in the chat. I will ask that, but also if others have questions on chat, or if others would like to ask one in person, we will. You can once Kosai finishes speaking, you can just click the raise hand function. I think that exists. Or I don't know, maybe send me a message, something like that, and I'll call on you and we can do that. So just think of your questions as this last question to Kosai, which is, So you've written recently, Kusai, about the resistance committee experience, or rather how the resistance committee experience in Sudan can actually be viewed as not a unique thing, but as part of a small but growing tradition of African revolutionary, popular democracy sort of practices. So could you just take us through that? Could you link this to some other things that this comes out of and help us to contextualize this?
Okay, thanks, April. Can you hear me well?
Yeah.
Okay, so I in addition to what Rabab and Hussam were talking about, I thought that maybe I can talk about an additional dimension, which is how the resistance committee's experience in Sudan can be viewed as part of a small African revolutionary tradition, a tradition of popular democracy. It's, I would say, a small tradition that is just is small, but is growing. And as you mentioned, we published in August 2022 a paper that compares the experience of Sudan's resistance committees with the experiences of what is known as the neighborhood committees in Haiti or Haiti. Haiti, I would say Haiti, as the people of Haiti like to call it. An experience that existed between mid 1980s to the mid 1990s. There is also the experience of the Western Cape anti-eviction campaigns, Southern Africa or South Africa or Tanzania in early 2000. These experiences have many commonalities or many similarities with the RCs in Sudan. And when we did that comparison, the idea was that to show that the experience of the resistance committees in Sudan is already not entirely unique to Sudan. Although it has its unique features, embedded in the Sudanese experience itself, but it is a part of a larger picture. The elements of the struggle, the popular struggle, the elements of the aspiration of peoples to to emancipate themselves from shackles, from limiting conditions, is quite shared. And then when you add on top of that similarities in terms of the historical and cultural aspects of resistance, then it is not surprising that you will get things that you can comparable experiences, not necessarily identical experiences, but comparable. And I wanted to mention these things in order to basically speak also to the movement in Kenya that learning from other examples is what we do. Either it kind of comes with the experience itself, with getting engaged in what's happening, or by reading history, or by both. So in Haiti, the neighborhood committees, they had similar main features: decentralized units, active in localities by the members of the localities. They had mixed activities, neighborhood services, cleaning public spaces, solving some needs, almost playing the role of municipalities in some ways. Also, they had this aspect of seeking revenge from the Duvalier brutal regime, which have basically fell down in Haiti in mid 1980s, but it ruled Haiti for almost 2 decades. It was like, if you probably heard about Papa Doc and Baby Doc, the father and the son, they ruled Haiti back to back, and it was terrible era. So there was this aspect, the motivational, political motivation, but they eventually developed further, and they were successful in something that the Sudanese resistance committees almost were successful in. And that is, they actually foiled the neighborhood committees in Haiti. They actually foiled a military coup that took place in January 1991, the Sudanese resistance committees almost foiled the October 25, 2021 military coup in Sudan as well. And from there, they also grew to influence politics through conscientization of communities and sponsoring running officials. But in September 1991, so it's 9 months later, another coup succeeded. And similarly, almost similarly to what happened in the resistance committees in Sudan, the neighborhood committees were vilified. They were ruthlessly chased and basically to be punished by the traditional powers in the country, the elites and the career politicians, because the neighborhood committees represented in Haiti what basically the resistance committees in Sudan represented, which is pulling the rug from the traditional politics. So as Hussam, I think, mentioned as well, that there were traditional pathways to enter politics in Sudan, and is really in many countries, whether in Africa and abroad, whether in developing and undeveloped countries, if we can use these terms, is that you get into politics either through joining political parties or sometimes through the student movement, and then you upgrade to joining political parties, or through trade unions, if you have organized trade unions that are kind of entangled with politics in ways. But the resistance committees will allow people to enter politics from different pathways, a new pathway, or different pathways, actually, not even one. But basically, this was not forgiven. This was a threat to all the political players that were there. I mean, if they were to unify on something, is that they don't want a new threat. And the resistance committees or the neighborhood committees in Haiti represented that threat, as the resistance committees in Sudan represented that kind of threat. And if we go further into discussing the politics in Sudan, you will see how many political parties later on vilified and attacked the resistance committees, which is to be expected. So this similarity. I mean, in Sudan, we even had some resistance committees were called neighborhood committees. And in Sudan, we wrote this to also kind of shed light for our people in Sudan, that despite how we really looked with some pride, justified pride, to how the resistance committee experience seemed very unique in the region around us. We have to be humble in terms of learning that the struggle of peoples around the globe is not very divorced from what we are doing, and we are not unique in that sense. We can only be as unique as the circumstances are. So we actually talked in that publication as well, and how this should be taken as a positive sign, because Haiti has made a huge contribution, an enormous contribution to the freedom project for humanity at large, not just for Africans, not just for the Haitian people. It's for humanity at large. If we look at the Haitian Revolution, I would say, and I would argue, as I did before, that it was really the birthplace of universal human rights. So we should feel pride in actually that there are some comparable cases with Haiti, despite how we look at Haiti now as a place that has been unstable for decades. But that was for reasons. The powers, the global powers, for many reasons, punished Haiti more than ever, and they have always been, not allowing Haiti, not being able to forgive Haiti for establishing a chain reaction of revolution since the beginning of the 19th century. So that's the one example. The other example is the Western Cape anti-eviction campaigns. So you have residents of poor townships, you have civic organizers, you have retrenched workers, union activists, and shop stewards, as well as ex-members of the ruling tripartite coalition. So these are ex-members, members that kind of decided to leave the tripartite coalition. You have a group of them, a kind of sort of a collaboration between all of these, an alliance between all of these, to challenge the state unjust laws and to rally against evictions and service cutoffs that happened in poor townships in the Western Cape. So these groups or this campaign use multiple methods, including protests, sit-ins, disruptions, challenging the state, at courts of law, using constitutional rights of shelter and access to basic rights. They insisted also on being independent from NGOs and from political parties because they viewed both as hijackers of causes and formalizers of funding streams that eventually domesticate popular causes. These causes, if the NGOs and the political parties, take hold of these campaigns, then they basically hijack them and turn them into mundane activism that don't challenge the established rules. So the movement learned from the anti-apartheid struggle methods and added to them. One thing that we were talking about here is basically how, when we talk about democracy, and that's I think what Rabab mentioned, democracy now, if you just say democracy, it means different things to different people. So the anti-eviction campaign allied itself with other groups, similar causes, and then they form what is called the Popular People's Alliance. I think Popular People's Alliance, I'm just going to try to remember, but it's something like that. The Poor People's Alliance or something like that. But basically, the idea was to challenge electoral democracy and electoral politics in general by insisting and by emphasizing that popular democracy is not the same as electoral politics, and that you don't solve people's problems, especially the poor, by simply going to the voting polls and give your vote to politicians. And until now, it is active in South Africa. It had its ups and downs, but basically these two experiences have many similarities with the experience of resistance communities in Sudan. Although it is easy to argue that they did not really look to each other to learn, but the experience itself, or the experiences, brought them together. They made them reach in many ways similar conclusion in terms of how to fight and how to continue fighting. And I think I will stop here, and then maybe we'll see in the questions section.
Thank you so much. And thank you to all three of you for these insights. I think there's so many things where even though we're on Zoom, I think if we were in a room, there'd be so many times that people would be snapping or just saying yes, because a lot of what you've said has been so resonant with, at least from my perspective, what I've observed in Nairobi from just last couple of months. And I think it's true for probably a lot of our audience. So why don't we go into questions right now? I think there are three that I see in the chat, which I'll just say, I'll read them out, all three, and then the three of you can split and decide, who wants to answer what. And then after that, if anyone would like to ask something, on video, then you can just do the raise your hands thing and we'll unmute you. So we have a question from Wasab, which is greetings and thanks for the platform. I wanted to ask about farmers unions and their proximity to the SPA. We didn't get so much time today to talk about these farmers unions, but and that's something that actually, if you look at the links that were sent not too long after we started this, that first link, Hammer and Hope, is a piece that Rabab actually co-wrote with Sarah Abbas and Nisrin Elamin, where they interviewed a farmer and labor organizer called Abdul Rauf Omer. That's the Hammer and Hope piece. If you want to know more about the farmers side of this organization, I would recommend that one. But yeah, so that's question number one. Question from Michael Niego is, I would just like to hear the guests talk about how they saw the Kenyan protests as they unfolded. What were their reactions or analysis to the situation, if any, especially in relation to the recent Sudanese experience? And then finally, by H. Moki Mbunga, thank you for organizing this important conversation. Could Rabab say more about the political school of the resistance committees? She mentioned it in passing, but it would be nice to hear more about how the school was organized. So yeah, go ahead, open the floor.
Did I start this? Okay, so the question for the union, farmer unions and SPA, Students Professional Association, I would just like thank you, April, for that referral to the article. To the best of my knowledge, there is really no proximity to the country, but like I don't want to go too much into it because it will like necessitate a critique of the Sudanese Professional Association and the missed opportunity within that. And I don't think we have enough time because if I start this, I'm not gonna. You don't want to get me started on this. So to the other question, but sorry, just to the farmer union point is I think it's important to note that the transitional government, including because at the end there was like almost two fractions, like two parts of SPA, pro transitional government and maybe almost anti, but not quite sure. Anyway, they proposed a 2021 act, and that act is basically a copy paste of 2005 act. And union farmers have been in struggles in court and on the street since 2005 against that act to have the supposed revolutionary transitional government. And I said that with like all the irony to reinstate the 2005 one. And this is not because for lack of alternatives, because farmer unions did propose almost like 11 months before that, sometime in 2020, their own version of the law, but you still have elites making laws and acts and not involving people who are actually affected by this. And it's basically a privatization act. I don't going to this question about the political school of resistance committee. Just following on Qusay's point, and I think that's really important to recognize that it's like the resistance committee is not necessarily unique to Sudan, and it's also not unique to even 2013 or like 2018, right? So when I say that, it's I don't think there's like a concrete sense to it, but a major feature is the transparency in the last maybe 4 or 5 years, the insistence of transparency. And it has a lot to do with people access to the internet to begin with and the way things have evolved. But the development, it's a work in progress. I don't think there is like a one just stand. For example, I think in the coup of 2021, we had the three no's, and to a large extent, that three no's were similar to no's in Myanmar. They also had the coup maybe like I think months ahead of us, and even the same slogan of the three, it was in Sudan and all of that. So it was almost again us learning and borrowing from other struggles across the global south. But that I always like to think of the political school, again, just like stating that and grounding that it's an evolving concept, but I always like to see it in terms of the evolving of the slogans. In 2018, we started with just fall and civilian, and we've learned all the way to having political charters with some sort of clear ideas, to having even the slogan being about free health, free education, and all of that. So like us going away from, for example, austerity or neoliberal political and political economical measures have kinda evolved, and that evolved with the political schools of resistance committee. And we've seen that you can just simply take 5 or 6 slogans from early 2019 until like 2023 or even now. One of them is including for the military to go back to the barracks and the Janjaweed to be dissolved. Janjaweed is RSF. So what's going on right now? This world is going on right now, right? So that evolving of the political school, you can see, you can follow from just fall without necessarily advocating for what's the alternative to last week, even during the war. Again, I keep mentioning Mayirnu Resistance Committee, but they put out a statement on Facebook saying that a revolutionary is not just supposed to critique what's going on, they're supposed to provide and live the revolutionary alternative. And they put that as an intro to calling for a cooperative, an agricultural cooperative that they can link to centralized kitchen, and they were asking for, or like they're putting a call for help for alternative source of energy. So this can be seen as a development of the political schools for that particular resistance committee. And I cannot, like, again, I really need to emphasize that I really don't think it's accurate or beneficially to study resistance committee across, but like this is just one example, right? We can't necessarily just generalize without being critical of what's actually going on. But this is an evolving of that political school instead of just saying just fall or just a civilian government without talking about the economical policies or the economical structure of what is wealth, like how wealth is being distributed. We are now at a point where those resistance committee are asking for cooperatives, agricultural cooperative, for centralized kitchen. They're asking for alternative source of energy and all of that. They're getting more involved into sustainable policy that will improve day-to-day livelihood and give us food sovereignty and just open avenue for what comes to the future. Hussam, do you want to take the next one?
Yeah, no,
Or
no.
Hussein?
Yes, I want to add a little bit to the question or the answer about the farmers unions, and so they have always, we have just adding some details here. The 2005 act that Rabab mentioned is related to the Jazeera scheme. This is the largest agricultural scheme in Sudan, and which the most organized farmers movement is based. It is the breadbasket of Sudan, as people say. And the farmers have always been, so different farmers' unions in different parts of Sudan have always been politically active. So they went hand in hand with the labor unions from the early 20s or 30s, so the beginning of the labor movement in Sudan. And again, we see here the fact that so the farmers' union played an important role in organizing people during the December 2018 revolution. So they were the farmers are themselves the farmers' union members. The legitimate farmers' union members are politically affiliated with the opposition parties, the political parties. They are citizens of different villages, so they are also members of these neighborhood resistance committees. So it was one of the an additional maybe manifestation of how the different forms of organizing have evolved in order to make the September or December 2018 revolution, the December revolution, successful. But again, what Rabab said is true, that at the moment when the old regime's leader, the president, was toppled, the traditional parties, even the transitional government, has sided with the other parts of the farmers that represented basically the old regime. So this divide and conquer tactic that is being used by the colonizers, that is being used by national governments, has been used even by the revolutionary, supposedly revolutionaries, once they took power, and so they ended up dividing the or having more than one farmers union, including one that is siding with the government, that is pushing for the same old regime's policies. And this brings me to an important point. I think we need to highlight here about one of the lively discussions in the Sudanese. So part of the learning and discussions that we're having about the resistance committees in Sudan, these are grassroots bodies, and they should be open to those who are based in a certain neighborhood. Because of the political interference of parties, or because of the differences between a neighborhood committee that is, or a resistance committee that is closer to the center than another one that is in the peripheries, as an example, you would have differences in opinions, differences in goals and means. And as such, do we want to have it open to all? And then that would probably make it difficult to agree on a radical agenda or on a truly revolutionary agenda, or not? Do you want to keep them closed for those who are very aligned in the political attitudes and directions? This is a debate that is still, I don't think that we reached conclusions to. And in my view, and I think many people share this with me, we should not be afraid of having more than one, simply more than one resistance committee in one place. If the fact that it is also this same debate is in the trade unions. Do you want to have necessarily one trade union representing all and achieving nothing, or having more than one trade union, but that are aligned to? So this is a debate, I think, that I'm sure has been the people in Kenya and in other parts of the world, including these protests in Kenya now, are going through in different ways or forms. Because at one point, if you close these grassroots organizations, so if you close them, you close the membership and make it very restrictive. What difference do they have with political parties? So is developing them to become political parties the way to go, or do you want it to be open because it's being open brings more people to participate? I think these are questions that we need to ask and answer. And my personal take on the how the recent protest in Kenya went, I didn't have a lot of information besides so of course you can't rely on the mainstream media. I listen to Democracy Now, so doing interviews with many of those who participated in the protest. I have family and friends who live in Nairobi now, but for me they were inspiring. The fact that they managed to achieve this, to achieve at least the government sacking and installing a new government, is something that should give hope of what can be achieved. But at the same time, I know that the Kenyan people are aware that, well, this is So the government is now through to the president, and the government are preparing for the next round of how to make sure that this never happens again. And let Qusay, if he wants to add anything.
Okay. Yeah, so I will try to talk a little about the Kenyan situation, at least from maybe a Sudanese point of view, but also a Pan-African perspective, because really that's what interests me in the Kenyan situation. Of course, the Kenyan people know that this thing started with the loan that was given by the IMF in April 2021, because every loan from the IMF comes with conditions, and these conditions are then requested that the government should implement those conditions, and then the government will have to face the wrath of the people when they try to implement the conditions. And then the IMF from afar acts like, no, we did not really tell you to do exactly that, but we said do some government reform. But this is a very it's a boring and repeated story. It does not only happen in all African countries. It happens in many African countries more than once. And here where we see the element of how international powers, or the global dynamics of the global economic system works and has a hand in all of these things. So after the loan, the Kenyan government decided that they will try to address the budgetary aspects of the budgetary problems through taxes, through increasing taxes. And it's almost like they, politicians read from the same book, but they don't learn, and they repeat the same mistake, because this is very resonant of what happened in Sudan, what happened in Tanzania before, what happened in other African countries. The bill itself, is based on the premise that it is always better to fund, the state through taxation rather than through debt, which, when you put it at face value, is difficult to argue against. It's always better to tax than to borrow. But the problem with taxation, and the problem with how you deal with budgetary issues at the level of the state, is that it's not just whether you tax the people or not. It's because taxation itself is not like a good or evil issue. It is always about how are you going to collect the taxes and how are you going to spend them. And within that, it is who are you going to tax. So the bill, went through a number of reviews, and of course, with the protest of the people, they tried to fix it. But once a bill like that, when it comes out, when you have a bill like that coming out, the first version is the real bill. Any other reading or any other version is really trying to fix something that is already, it already shows what your direction is as a government, the first bill. And of course, because of that, although they say that in the readings and the second versions, they took out the elements of the bill that angered the population, which is basically, it's really something that they should expect. I mean, you're trying to increase taxes on the basic, wage goods of the people, and this is bad on many aspects. It's basically bad politically, that's for sure, but it's also bad from a developmental perspective. So the second versions, or the versions that came out after that, by taking out what the things that made the people protest in the beginning, obviously the people will not accept any revisions. They will want to revoke the entire bill, because the first bill is the bill. The second, from political perspective, is trying to tone down things, but you have already shown us what you are intending to do. You have already shown us what is your main vision of how you're going to solve this budgetary aspect. And this is repeated because it's going to basically take the people out on the streets. And then you're going to have a political problem that is much bigger than the economic problem you assumed or you claim to be trying to fix. And this is not like new news. By now, in developmental studies or development studies, it has become a rule that you cannot have price inflation on basic wage goods. If I can just read a quotation from a recent book on African economic development, and this was published in 2020, so it's not really far behind. So those who made the bill should have at least kind of read around. So the most serious constraint on financing a cumulative dynamic of investment, productivity growth, and employment and savings stems from the price inflation of basic wage goods. This compromises both savings by the workers and the profitability of investment, and can also threaten political stability, which is exactly what happened in Kenya. So for industrialization and structural change to proceed, there must be no inflationary price increase of necessities. So this is like by now it is common knowledge, and it's not common knowledge by economic analysis. It's common knowledge by experience. It happened in so many countries, not only in Africa, and it was always or almost always a failure, a drastic failure. So now we come to the point where we have a revolution at our hands. But basically, the way the people are instigated to come out and to talk and to be involved in politics is through affecting their daily life in that drastic way. However, once the people get involved, in politics and in decision making, and then basically review what is happening and start talking to each other seriously, that's the beginning of the revolution. It becomes this constant conscientization. People start to become more aware, more conscious about what's happening. They become more critical of decision makers that for a while, many people used to think of them as people who know what they are doing. And it turns out, no, they don't. It becomes a movement. So basically, and this is really what happened in Sudan, as we know, Rabab and Hussam earlier expressed. So it's what is happening in Kenya is a beginning of a revolution, and it usually revolutions like that happen by stupid mistakes from politicians, because the people are smarter in general. The people are smarter than their leaders, political leaders, and that's a general statement that is almost always true. And for some reason, you have political systems that really promote and upgrade and bring people to power who are not the brightest, who are not the most caring for the population. And within this process, education, political education and economic education becomes very important. So, for example, what is being done right now? What is the Until Everyone is Free podcast is doing is part of the revolution because of that. And I can go on, of course. I mean, part of my work is related to looking into development governance in East Africa and Africa at large. So I can go on for this, but I'm going to end this particular aspect of this point by a quotation from one of the important economists of our times, Hajun Chan. He said, in a capitalist economy, democracy is meaningless if people cannot understand the language of power, which is economics. And I think that is very important. So this is what's happening right now, I think, in Kenya, and I think this is the beginning of a revolution. So that regarding that point. There was another question that maybe I can just touch upon quickly. That was about, was there any relationship or any linkages between the neighborhood committees in Haiti and the guerrilla or the militias or the resistance groups, armed resistance groups? I can only say that I have not enough information to answer this question. But basically, the story of the neighborhood committees was mostly very localized, very urban, very civilian. Actually, it wasn't just urban, it was also urban and rural, but basically very civilian. And it kind of happened within that context. So I am not sure, and I don't have enough information about linkages with guerrilla warfare. Thank you.
Thank you so much to all of our speakers for your time. I know there are a couple of questions that we didn't get to, but we're running up to 2 hours and I want to be respectful of everyone's time. So I want to wrap up with, I think, Qusay, you left us on such a great note earlier, what you said about I mean, it's not hard, I think, for Kenyans to agree with you that the people certainly are smarter than this current administration. I think that's the butt of most of the jokes of this is it's them. Like these kind of people are the ones who are fighting against. But I think in this movement also you see reflected these incremental steps, like the raising of political consciousness, even just, you know, in these teach-ins and in the spaces of political discourse that have come up since the last couple of months, there are things that I've heard that I never expected to hear in public in Kenya, you know, a place where this kind of open discussion of politics and especially of left politics has been so stamped out. I think it's wonderful to see that the conversations that young people, that particularly Gen Zs in Kenya are having now are different to those that were had, you know, by those who were 10, 20, 30 years older than them. They are not moved, you know, by this kind of ethnic divide and rule discourse, and they are not happy to, you know, send in their representative to speak. They are not happy to let an opposition politician like Raila represent them. And so I think these incremental moves, even if, you know, there's still so much work to do in terms of organizing and things like that, I think what you mentioned about the sort of irresistible progress of revolution and the sort of incremental thing, even if, you know, these contexts are so different, that there is something about people's circumstances and something about the human will for self-determination and to get there together that is universal. And I really thank you both for helping to sort of put forward and to facilitate this kind of Pan-African discourse, discussion, and sharing of all of these things. And I want to thank everyone who's here in the room with us for joining. As mentioned earlier, this will be recorded and published online, and there are going to be many, many more people who will listen to it later. But thank you all for being here, and until next time.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you, April and team, and thank you, everyone.